It's the 4th century AD. A merchant ship sails out of the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden, along one of the busiest maritime routes in the world. The trade route that connected the Roman Empire and its ports in Egypt with India. But this ship and its crew are neither Roman nor Indian. They are Aksumite, hailing from the bustling port of obelisks in present-day Eritrea. Their destination, the flourishing ports along India's west coast. The boat is filled to the brim with Aksumite goods to sell: ivory, tortoiseshell, rhino horn, and gold. In exchange, they hope to acquire steel and spices, valuable commodities both in Aksum and in the Roman Empire to their north. These African merchants were vital cogs in this far-reaching trade route, making both them and the kingdom they hailed from all the richer. It's The Ancients on History Hit. I'm Tristan Hughes, your host. Today we're exploring the story of the Kingdom of Aksum, situated largely in what is today northern Ethiopia and Eritrea. Incredibly well positioned, with strong contacts to the Roman Mediterranean, India, Arabia and Mesopotamia, the Kingdom of Aksum flourished and became incredibly powerful in the first millennium AD. Today, it is most famous for the gigantic stelae obelisks that towered over its main city, and for the kingdom's early conversion to Christianity in the 4th century. But, as you're about to hear, there is so much more to Aksum's story. To explain all, I was delighted to interview the archaeologist and Aksum expert Dil Singh Basanti, a PhD candidate at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Dil has worked out in Ethiopia on Aksum's archaeology for several years and holds a particular interest in Aksumite mortuary monuments and burial practices. He's a fantastic speaker and his passion for all things Aksum shines through. It's infectious. I really do hope you enjoy. Dil, it is a pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Tristan. I really appreciate you having me.
And to talk about the Kingdom of Aksum, there is so much to explore with the story of Aksum and its incredible archaeology. There is so much to talk about.
Yeah, we've really had an explosion of work in the last couple of decades. So prior to that, we've just had excavations in a few areas in the capital city and a couple of other cities themselves. But since then, we've had work going on from some of the earliest times. We have a new cultural horizon that stretches back even deeper in time, going on into the medieval times and after. So we're really getting a horizontal and vertical spread across the Aksumite region.
We've got a big period of time to cover. And you mentioned there in passing the capital. So Dil, where are we talking about with the Kingdom of Aksum with modern countries?
Yeah, so the capital itself, Aksum, is in northern Ethiopia in a state called Tigray, the Tigray Plateau. But the actual polity, we don't fully know the boundaries. A lot of the work that's been done, it's, as we see in many places, where you have roads and where you can actually get to. So a lot of it trends towards the east of Aksum, and then we have a lot of older work that was done in Eritrea. So we know that it took up a lot of current Tigray going into Eritrea. There are times in its history that it stretched across the sea and had some sort of influence in South Arabia. There's oral traditions in Uganda that relate to Aksum that we don't really know how those relate. You go down to central, southeast parts of Ethiopia, you'll find Aksumite coinage there. I've worked in Amhara in the more like central north state, where you'll have oral traditions of things that different Aksumite kings built and things going on there as well. But that full history itself is unexplored. So we don't really know the full boundaries. Right now, we're focused more on the Tigray state and that those northeast regions of Ethiopia going into Eritrea.
But Dil, thinking about that area of the world in antiquity, if you've got the Red Sea there, connections with Arabia, southern Arabia, as you've mentioned, the Horn of Africa, this feels like an incredibly important and strategic area of the world geographically where you find this ancient kingdom rising.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's strategic and it's in a good location for a few different reasons. Because first of all, there is like the political interest and the economic interests over the Red Sea trade and the Indian Ocean trade. There's times when I believe it was Justinian the First like sent a letter to Aksum to persuade them to go into South Arabia. And he said it was because the king of the area, Donawas, was persecuting Christians. But it seems that they were maybe more interested in silk prices and wanted an ally in the region. We find many aspects of the trade that we can go into. We have shipwrecks carrying Ayakaba amphora coming from Jordan in the Red Sea. We find Ayakaba all over the place. You go into people's homes today, just like the compounds, and amphora litter the floors, right? And we have a monastery, as I was talking about earlier to you, how some of the monasteries keep a lot of the ancient artifacts, and there's a big sort of indigenous component to archaeology and so forth. We have a monastery that literally has a cache of Buddhist coins from the Kushana empires in Pakistan, Punjab, Afghanistan, like there. And, so you have these economic interests. But before that, there is also a mix of cultures going on in the area, which coming from a Semitic influence. So, because the primary language during Aksum in the area is mostly a Semitic language, but mixing in with cultures from Sudan as well, which is where the stela tradition probably comes from. So it was already like an area of interaction that, well, for that reason, became important for economic and political reasons in many different scales.
Can you talk to us a bit about the types of source material that we have, that experts and archaeologists like yourself have for learning more about the Kingdom of Aksum?
Aksum was always kind of internationally known, and that comes from textual material. So we have foreign records, and we have had histories of Aksum written just with foreign materials coming from the Greeks and historians. We have poetry from Arabia that talks about Aksum. We have economic works dealing with the trade. That's usually what foreign records are referring to. So the most famous is the Periplus of the Red Sea, which is written in the first century and lists the Aksumite port, Adulis, and talks about Aksum as the capital controlling influence over that region. So we have these foreign records. We have internal inscriptions in Guz, as well as Sabian and Greek from the various kings in the area. And then we also have oral tradition that relates to the histories in Aksum. And that's a good way to find sites. And that's a good way to get sort of a preliminary idea of the dating in some places, or at least like try to figure out what cultural horizon you're working with. Then we also have coins, which is kind of an international textual material because those are found all over the place. When they're original, we also have counterfeit coins because the Romans are actually making counterfeits of Aksumite coins. So we find those in Palestine, we found those in Sri Lanka and so forth, but they're like a little smaller. They're these miniature versions. So we have coinage, which is another big study. And then we have the more traditional historical and archaeological methods. So excavations, we had accounts of explorers going back to Francisco Alvarez in the 15th century, but then formal excavations began in the 19th century. And those have continued periodically. We had a big set of recordings in the early 1900s, and then a set of excavations that were published in the mid 20th century. And then from 1970, we had a good deal of work before an interruption with the change in the political regimes until mid 1990s, where we've had more sustained archaeological work. First in just a few areas, but now there's a lot of teams from all over the place working in Tigray and with Aksum and Aksumite cultures.
Well, let's explore one of those horizons that it seems, well, you hinted at earlier, is being expanded currently, which surrounds the origins of the Kingdom of Aksum. Now, Dil, what do we know about this, how this kingdom emerges?
Yeah. So this has been one of the things that's been changing in recent years and how people think about Aksum. There used to be a model where Aksum was thought to be colonized by South Arabia sometime in maybe around 800 BC. The earliest sites in Aksum at that time, which would be the Temple of Yeha, had South Arabian features and was dedicated to a South Arabian pantheon of polytheistic gods. So Al-Mukab, the god of the moon, was the biggest of those. And then there was another site, Wukro area as well, that was uncovered. When you get to a new archaeological area, the first thing you find are the big things, or the first thing you're looking at, the big things. So the earliest big things we had were South Arabian, right? But since the archaeological work has accumulated, we have cultural horizons stretching back. There was a wave of sites popping up from around the 900 BC to 1200 BC range, with Mayadrasha excavated by UCLA, Seglemen by University of Napoli L'Orientale. The Ona culture up in Eritrea around Asmara was one of the first by Peter Schmidt and Matthew Curtis. And then Gulu Makeda, which is a site that's on that route between Aksum and the port city that found out was earlier than the trade, and all these sites were earlier than Yeha. In addition to that, that area that I just talked about, Gulu Makeda, they recently published in the last couple of years dating that goes back to about 1600 BC. It shows some of the earliest like agriculture working in the area. So the current idea that we have is that there are movements and migrations and interactions going on a very large scale, going out to the Arabian Peninsula and the Semitic influences that would come there, mixing with things that were very local. The earliest place we find the Sila tradition is actually in near Kassala in Sudan. And that's in the second millennium, early second millennium BC or so. And so that seems to be the earliest thing that we consider in the complex of the sites or cultural region that we're talking about. And it looks like we're having a big interaction sphere with people from there interacting with people arriving more from coastal regions, probably using what we call the Tekeza River Valley, which is one of the feeding rivers into the Lake Tana and then the Blue Nile. And so there's probably like agro-pastoralist groups that are interacting with settled communities. And within this big sphere of interaction, you start having complex polities emerge.
So Aksum emerges, and of course we call it the Kingdom of Aksum, which I'm guessing kind of gives the game away. Dil, do we know much about the whole social and political structure of the Kingdom of Aksum?
Yeah, so we do know they had a king who's called Negus.
Surprise, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's mentioned in the Periplus, and that's we see that in the inscriptions and so forth. The different Negusas, the most famous being King Azana, erected inscriptions to his many military victories over surrounding groups, going up to Merowe, actually in Sudan. And then we also have a coinage line where the kings were actually imprinting their likenesses on the coin. So we have been able to get a king's list from that, but it's also incomplete. So like some of the kings we know about because they're, you have to go to India and you find the coins there that talk about kings you didn't really know about in Aksum before. And all of a sudden you find a coin with a new king on it, right? So we do have like a king's list, but the entire range of kings is not well known. A lot of them are only really known from coinage. And there's a lot of reading between the lines on how the kings talk and how various people talk about the kings, where it looks like there's something called the Negusa Nagast, the king of the kings. And then there does seem to be some regional political system that had their own centralized heads as well. So it's not just the king, but there does seem to be a sizable nobility. Now, that is for the Aksumite period. Going before that, we don't really know. There's a lot more legendary traditions and oral traditions that relate to kings. But at least from the Aksumite period, we do start seeing a king's list and we do start seeing all these references.
And do we know then if you say there evidently was this nobility and almost, I guess, almost a hierarchy of people in control? You mentioned earlier Aksum as the capital. Do we know of many other key urban centers in this kingdom?
So we know about a few. There's the ones that are mentioned in the Periplus. So Adulis is the main port of Aksum. And there's another town they mentioned that I believe they say was like a 3 days walk away called Kaloe. And there's two sites that might match up to. One is Matara, which was excavated, I believe, in the 60s or 70s. And we haven't really had much work since, and not much is known about it. The other one, and more likely one, is a place called Kohaido. These are both in southern Eritrea. So Kahaido seems to be another urban center. And in the Periplus, that's mentioned as the first place where you can get ivory, which was the primary export of the Aksumites. So Kahaido is a big one. One of my colleagues and professors, Matthew Curtis, was working there in the early 2000s, but unfortunately we had conflict starting in the regions at that time between the border war. And since then, no work has been really done there. So there's many like urban places we know about that people just can't get to. And that's one of them. And then there's just a plethora of sites. So Mike Harrow up at John Hopkins has been doing some of the most instrumental work in looking at settlement patterns. And what we actually find is when the change from what we call the pre-Aksumite period to the Aksumite period, pre-Aksumite period has a few centralized sites that appear much more hierarchical. And we see that with some of the Sabian temple features as well, that their entire like spatial syntax is about like restricting access. When we get to the Aksumite period, it's not that these cities get bigger, they actually get smaller. They decentralize a bit. There's definite population growth, and there's a lot more infilling. So it's more like a conglomeration of centers from excavations that we've seen in the 90s under Phillipson. It looks like there's a bunch of satellite sites that are all interdependent. So you start having these like urban clusters. So you have a few major metropolises that seem to be mentioned along the trade between Aksum, Gulu Makeda, which I mentioned earlier, or at least like urban areas is how we have to start thinking about them. Going up to Kohaido and then Adulis. But we have all these other sites too that just sort of Matthew Curtis, when we were working out in Shidip, he'd go out on survey for like a week and a half and find 6 settlements and then a cemetery everyone lost for like 60 years or something. So there's all these other sites that seem to have some urban sense of specialization to them and seem to be interdependent with everything else going on.
Could we imagine potentially is the G word? Could they potentially be these kind of guilds or something like that?
They totally could be. With the specialization that we're seeing, people that aren't working in Aksum, they're just working on the Indian Ocean trade, do talk about those guilds operating on the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean trade, or some sense of commercial groups or brotherhoods. So there may be something like that going on in Aksum that probably originates in its own way and then maybe interacting with these larger economic structures. The archaeological correlate that we can definitely say is that a lot of them do seem specialized, either for hide working or other types of manufacture and so forth. They do seem to be their own industrial units.
So let's move on to trade. Highly anticipated this chapter in our conversation, given the hints you've already given regarding how important it is. And if we focus first on maritime trade, because you mentioned the port of Adulis, which does feel to be really, really significant. If you were an Aksumite trader and you had a ship and you were going from somewhere like Adulis, or let's say from Adulis, how far and wide were the Aksumite maritime contacts? How far and wide could you trade your goods?
Yeah, so we have a couple of sources for that, a couple of documentary sources. The first is the Periplus, which mentions a lot of the ports. But there's another hitchhiker in the 6th, 7th centuries, Cosmas and Decuplestes. So we're not sure if he made it to where he says he made it or implies that he made it. But it looks like from his readings, we can gather that the main ports of Aksum were actually in Sri Lanka. And he seems to mention Aksumite ships themselves. And we do find Aksumite artifacts, coinage, and pottery popping up in Gujarat, popping up in Tamil Nadu, in other places in southern India, and then popping up in Sri Lanka as well, which I mentioned earlier. We find some of the Roman counterfeits down there, right? So we do find artifacts that are corroborating that to some degree. We don't know if Indigo Places himself went down to Sri Lanka himself, but he certainly talks about Aksumite boats. He's actually there when one of the kings, King Khalid, is about to launch those wars into South Arabia, apparently, and is gathering his ships together for that. So that's the direction that we know Aksumites seem to show direct link and trade connections. They have very, very strong links, and probably a bigger injection of their trade was coming from the upper parts of the Red Sea into the Mediterranean. So Aqaba, like I said, it's actually a Roman emperor made in Aqaba, Jordan. That's probably the second most common pottery type we see in Aksum itself after the local red wares. But we also find in one of the main sites that's been excavated, Beta Georgis, they have before that late Roman III emperor and the Gaules type. And they can actually identify some of the manufacturers going to production centers in France or in ancient Gaul at the time. We do have redware coming in from Tunisia. So there's a big injection coming from this Mediterranean and Red Sea trade. And that's probably mostly where they're operating. And then there's a bunch of tangential hints that people will overinflate or dismiss this evidence depending on who's talking, but there may be relations with China in terms of some of the Han import lists match up with what's coming up with out of Aksum. And then there's mentions of kingdoms, Huangqi, which may relate in a lot of circumstantial factors to Aksum. We did find Castile in Aksum itself, which at the time is being made in China. But with iron production, there might be all sorts of things going on. What seems one of the more likely ones is that there are memoirs written immediately after the decentralization of Aksum after the Battle of Talis, where one of the generals from the Tang dynasty, when you trace out his route, this is work by Wilbur Schmidt, when you trace out his route, he seems to have made it to Aksum and then exited through the port of Adulis. So we're talking about like where are people interacting completely, you know, China may be involved in interactions, but we need to understand that if it is, it's more of an indirect thing. There are much bigger interactions going on between India, Rome, and we do find Sasanian ware, so going up into the Sasanian, regions in Iran and so forth as well. And we do have Arabic poetry, like I mentioned, from Iraq that talks about the Aksumite ships, and it has like very beautiful. It's a court poet that's basically bragging about their court, and in this case, bragging about a queen, and talks about the Aksumite ships just with imagery of them parting the foam of the water, like this caravan that he's talking about is going through the desert and parting away the sands. So those are the places that are seen to be interacting with Aksum. And it's not just that we're talking about direct trade links. We start talking about some of the virtual mechanisms trade, things like cosmopolitanism, globalization, so forth. Well, at least Ayakaba and some of the other amphora are very, very common throughout Aksum. But there is one place we don't see any imports at all in Aksum, and that is in the Stela Park in the Graves. So they
Ah.
do seem to, yeah. So they do seem to differentiate between local and foreign there, and we do see the same thing going on in other parts of the trade, where like there's sources in Egypt that talk about like Indians buying wine and getting drunk. There's sources in India that talk about the foreigners that eat way too much black pepper and so forth. So all these sort of categories of like foreignness are being built along these trades, and we see it in Aksum as well.
I'd like to quickly ask, because you've highlighted there, I don't need to ask it now because I think we've already covered it, like the importance of Aksum in that really significant trade route between the Roman Empire and India that we've covered in previous conversations, and also the fact that you highlighted there Aksumite ships. And I'm guessing, I didn't really think of Aksum as a maritime power, but having control of that important stretch of water can make the kings, the rulers of Aksum, incredibly, mighty and powerful because of all the trade going through. Alongside, contacts with Sri Lanka and India and Sasanian Persia and the Roman Empire, do we know whether the Aksumites also went down the east coast of Africa to places like Zanzibar and so on?
That's a good question. We actually don't know it from the Periplus. I think the last port they mention on the east coast of Africa is a place called Rapta, which may match up with Somalia. We generally don't know how far they're going into down the coast. The Swahili coast trade is something that would pick up after this more antiquity version of the Indian Ocean trade. That seems to be its own independent thing that occurs later, or is using, if there's any infrastructure there that they might be using that's not fully known to us. This is more larger investigative issues. We don't really know how far into the African interior or other parts of Africa going south and southwest that Aksum actually went. Going from the kind of known to the unknown we have, a lot of the excavations have occurred from Aksumite East going up to the Red Sea trade. So there's sort of a bias of information just in where we can do work and the best places to do work that kind of point to these international routes. And then we have, the interaction sphere between Sudan, those African roots in the immediate region that we are. But going beyond that, that's something that we don't fully know. That's what makes some of these other like chance finds or chance instance references to Aksum, such as oral traditions in Uganda and so forth. That's what makes them interesting. We don't really know much about them, and they haven't really been investigated in any way.
One last thing on the trading contacts. You mentioned ivory earlier, but what were some of the other main goods that the Aksumites were trading in, that they were exporting, and those that they were importing?
They seem to be mostly exporting raw materials, tortoiseshell, rhino horn, things like that. Ivory is above and beyond their major one. Myrrh was probably, this is another region that's important for myrrh, so that might have also been involved. As you know, this perishable trade doesn't, preserve as well in the archaeological record. There's what the Periplus says, but then there's also the additional things to that and the things that happen, because the Periplus is about the first century CE. Aksum seems to be most heavily involved in the third and fourth centuries. So by that time, we don't know exactly what shifted. Ivory seems to be the main thing. One of the Byzantine ambassadors to the region records in the area of Yeha about 5,000 elephants that he's probably guessing. We believe the Aksumites likely hunted elephants to extinction in the area. The only place that we still have an elephant population in that region today is up in Kafta Sharar, which I believe is in the few hundreds. And that's the northernmost elephant herd. So they seem to have hunted them to extinction. So they're importing wine. They're also importing heavy amounts of iron, at least during the time of the Periplus. They might have their own industry later. But that seems to be something that would be instrumental in the hunting of elephants, especially for spears and so forth. The ivory is actually very interesting because in Aksumite material culture, we see a lot of animal symbology, such as like walia ibexes, and then snakes are one of the biggest ones. And there's a lot more traditions and legends about snakes, but we never really see an elephant. So outside of the raw ivory, the elephant, the animal that's like actually hunted possibly to extinction in the area, or at least endangered to some degree, is what we don't see in any of the symbolism. Either Cosmas or another 6th century historian, Procopius, also mentioned the Aksumite king's chariot being pulled by 2 elephants as well. So those are some of the main things that we're seeing. The biggest import, at least in terms of the artifacts we find, is probably wine. There's probably other elements of trade coming in with like black pepper and so forth. Aksum appears to have its own vineyards at a later time. They're also importing a good amount of steel. And then their major export of all the things listed tends to be ivory.
Summer is finally here, but for those of you just like me who are counting down the days until the leaves turn golden, the nights start drawing in, and it's finally acceptable to spend a whole weekend binge-watching true crime in your PJs, After Dark, myths, misdeeds, and the paranormal can transport you there right now, twice a week, every week.
Tudor murder, ancient ghosts, Victorian mysteries. Our podcast has you covered. I'm Maddie Pelling.
And I'm Anthony Delaney, and we are friends and historians who love to find out about the darker side of history.
Join us on the scaffold for Anne Boleyn's final moments. Step inside Tutankhamun's tomb, which is apparently cursed.
Watch a jury deliberate the fate of the last 3 women to be hanged for witchcraft in England.
Find us every Monday and Thursday wherever you get your podcasts, and now on YouTube. After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds, and the Paranormal is created by the award-winning network History Hit.
I've also got in my notes something called the Afar Salt Trail. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so Afar is interesting. So that's a really cool region in the eastern part of Ethiopia, and it's legendary as like a travel destination because it's the hottest place in the world by average temperatures. I think it averages somewhere around like 140 Fahrenheit.
Okay, no thank you. No thank you.
And but it gets cooler because it's filled with sulfuric acid lakes in some of the regions or some of the areas, as well as like moving lava lakes that are totally, when you see those lava lakes flow, it is exactly what you want them to be in like imagination. Yeah, there's salt formations and everything. So people don't really live there. They mostly go just to mine salt, and they'll make them in these little blocks that in historic times was used as money, and people still barter today. We had always believed that Aksum was somehow involved there. And we find obsidian and other Aksumite sites, which Afar is a great obsidian source. I was there about 4 years ago, and there's people that still use obsidian flakes to shave. So there was more recent research by Helena Wodakiris out in that area, and she did find Aksumite sites, and she did trace back a caravan type trade going into the area. So most of her sites date to late Aksumite into medieval times, but she was finding earlier Aksumite material in there as well. So it seems to be the verification that we had that they were in that area, likely also mining salt, at least participating in some sort of caravan commerce.
Yes, you mentioned Helena Wodakiros there. And yeah, I saw her research on this and thought, actually, that's fascinating. So must ask it. And thank you very much for mentioning her name, because as I said, she's been leading that research, hasn't she?
Yeah, and there's like how you do your excavations or expeditions and so forth that we usually talk less about. And Helena, being humble, is very humble about hers. But she basically formed her own caravan. And so she was like one of the first, like, I think female caravans, or maybe the only female caravan operating in the time, just living in one of the most difficult areas to live in for like 5-6 months, finding all these Aksumite sites and engaging in this. It is some top level work and top level experience. It was very, very arduous undertaking. Very impressive.
Very impressive. What a story. Let's move on to arguably the most well-known symbolic monuments that have survived from the Kingdom of Aksum, which are, of course, these stelae. To introduce this, Dil, can you explain to us how the royal members of the Aksumite dynasty, how the elites buried their dead, and then how that relates to these great monuments?
Yeah, so the stela themselves are burial markers, and that's a tradition going back with agro-pastoral societies, as I mentioned, out in Sudan. So it seems to originate there, and the earliest site that we have with stela in Aksum is in Seglamen, which their dates are about 1000 to 500 BC for that cemetery area. And then by the time we get to Aksum, these stela, which were sometimes like only half a meter or so tall out in Sudan, are now all of a sudden monumental. So the biggest stela there is 32 meters tall. It weighs
Wow.
about 500 tons. Yeah, solid stone, like traditionally what we think of with like an obelisk or a stela. I think the one in Karnak is bigger, but this is one they actually tried to get it up, and the base for it is only about 2 meters. So it wasn't sufficient to keep the monument standing upright, so it immediately went down, and it seems to have shattered the top of another tomb called the Nephos Malcha. So we know it collapsed in ancient times. And so these stela, they're carved from the volcanic stone. It's a Nephilim stone. And so it's very likely that in ancient times, people saw people hauling these giant stones as blanks from this quarry. And then they seem to have worked them in place in the cemetery because we find at least one that's incompleted there. So they start erecting these stela in monumental forms, but there's hundreds of stela all across Aksum. And that cemetery itself, there's at least like 75, 76. It's located at the bottom of a hill, so sometimes stela get covered up, sometimes they get exposed. There's a lot of stela that are buried in the tombs as well, and sometimes we use as beds for some of the skeletons.
Stela buried in the tombs themselves.
Yeah, so actually, if you walk around that area in the right time of year with the right hydrology, you can see buried stela. And there's one in particular I'm thinking of that marks the entrance to a tomb that you can see there. And there may have been termination rituals going on with these stela, meaning that after their use life, they were ritually broken, terminated, disposed in some way. And some of them seem to have wound up as beds inside some of the tombs in the area. And so there's tons of these stela. Many of them are quite smaller, meter to like 3 or 4 meters, but there's 6 of them that were carved like to look like Aksumite elite structures. So they have multiple rows of windows and timber frames that would stick out of Aksumite architecture that we call monkey heads and doorways. So the main symbolism of that is on 6 of them. And those range in size from about 13 to the largest one, which was about 32 meters. And then there's other like proto forms of the symbolism where they make something that looks like a house, or they have lines and dots that look like the monkey heads as well. But the cool thing about the symbolism too, though, was that it was very heavily ritualized. So that stela I was talking about, the stela 1, which people usually believe that that marks the tomb for the king because it's the largest tomb there. When that collapsed, as I mentioned, these stela have little doorways on it. When that collapsed, they actually cut out the handle for the doorway to terminate the symbolism. And then you'll see it today, and it's collapsed. And that doorway, it's you could go see that the door handle is hacked out of the doorway symbolism there. So it's not just that these things are cosmetic; they had some sort of ritual power. They're imbued with a sense of power. They're radiating something, or they have this sort of meaning to them. And when you look at where the stela are located, they're in between 2 hills in front of the central water source. That is the worst place for a cemetery in all of Aksum, because all the runoff going down those hills that helps fill up that water source is going into those tombs. So some of those tombs are just always filled with water, and something is always falling down. But so it's the worst place to preserve skeletons if that is your goal. But it's the best place for monuments because everyone that is going to get water is going to see them. And in addition, those 2 hills, the hill in front, Mai Koho, it dips just enough in an area that in the morning, the hills are blocking the sun. And there is it's like a curtain of light that just comes down the stela in the morning, which people like see this all the time. We're not sure. It's probably not like ritually purposeful, but there's an aesthetic quality to where if you go there in the morning, like everything is dark out in front except for the stela, right? Except for the stela and the other Georgie's hill behind it. So they're kind of like illuminated. And that seems to be the time that they switched to this Nephilim material coming from Goberdera in the lifetime of the stela field. So that's why I say they seem to be taking advantage of it to some degree. The whole field seems very improvised. Like it's not Well, there's an element of planning, an element of improvisation to it. So it's not something I think they set out in the beginning to do to make it like a ritualized feature, but it's certainly an aesthetic effect that you have these like blue stones with these like twinkling phenocrysts just radiating in the light while everything in front of it is dark. And you can see that effect today. They're patented a bit now, but you can see the effect of them lighting up in the morning today, or at least that curtain of light coming down them.
Absolutely. I can see on a couple of images that, like, online, just that kind of the sunlight on those stela and how they really just stand out. And I had no idea. I was about to ask about the decoration, but you've answered my question for me with the doors and the windows and multiple levels of windows. It feels like they've accidentally also kind of designed the ancient Aksumite concept of what a skyscraper looks like today. They're striking.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. Yeah, that's a trip. I didn't think about it that way.
Are those stele then? I mean, do they endure for several centuries? And is it very much a status symbol? So only the richest in Aksumite society and the royalty would be able
Mm.
to have a stele erected when they die?
Yeah, so I actually answered your question quite poorly on that earlier. So traditionally, that has been what's interpreted with the stela. And it's because of just how we think who has the money to make these giant stela, which seems to be quite an undertaking. And then when you know that there is a king in the area, it's like, oh, okay, the largest stela should belong to a king. There's a convenient alliance between those ideas and the oral traditions in the area. So the oral traditions do mark the stela as kings, but they mark them all by one king. They mention a king called Ramhai, which we don't have from any other form of material culture referencing. But they believe all the stela were marked by these kings. At the same time, oral tradition is a lot more. People usually mark date with people. There's an aspect of that going on. But this convenience alliance between our ideas on monument construction and some of the oral tradition has created that impression. And the stela in other areas are markers for individual graves. In the stela park, they are not any longer. The biggest stela does mark two tombs. That seems to be one of them. It marks a tomb we call the mausoleum, which has 10 chambers off the central passageway that might have been designed to look like the inside of a stela because the cross section looks like a house. And in addition, the real kicker is that the inside was plastered with a lime-based plaster that doesn't have any water like protection puppies or anything, but it does have flecks of nepheline stone in it, the same stone that the stela are carved from. So they have that tomb. There's another tomb that people couldn't excavate because it's too dangerous called the East Tomb that's also marked and still unknown to us. The two other biggest stela in the area surrounding it has been excavated, don't seem to mark tombs at all. So the Stela Park is actually one of the best investigative features in African archaeology. And people, because we expect to find king's tombs there, like people are always kind of looking for it. But if you look at what's been excavated, there's not really a lot of areas left around the stela. So, and people still like hold out hope, but it's like, yo, I'm not sure if you're going to drop a 2x2 and find a royal tomb here in this area.
Going on to, I know, an area that you find really, really interesting. Perhaps those people are actually missing out on what is arguably even more impressive and interesting when it comes to Aksumite burials, which is how everyday Aksumites buried their dead. Now, you mentioned cemeteries earlier. So do we know a lot about kind of these cemeteries and burial rites and so on for people who are living in the Kingdom of Aksum, everyday people outside of these stele fields?
We do a bit. So though there has been one other stela field that has been excavated called the Gouda stela field, and that we usually take that more in reference of things we see in the stela park. And the stela park is part of a larger stela field called the Northern stela field. So those are two cemeteries where we kind of get our sources. The problem is that the hierarchy in Aksum may or may not be working as we traditionally think. So it's hard to tell what is a commoner's grave other than you have simpler grave goods, which the Gouda stela field does. But there's some fluidity because at least one of the stela there is bigger than some of the royal stela and the stela park. This is where I say there's a lot more variability going on. So people still attached to the kingly interpretation, but their mixture of classes is so fluid that it gets, at least from what we see from the mortuary material, that it gets hard to tell. Now, when we were excavating the steel field, it may be that, so these people were definitely rich, whoever's buried there. They're probably like a neighborhoody community based on what we see from some of the oxygen isotope research we've done on some of the remains. They're using at least that water source, or at least people that use the central water source. In addition, the people that were buried in the tomb that we have best excavated, called Tomb of the Brick Arches, which is one of the larger tombs and it's usually thought to be a middle class tomb, one of the things we see from the bones is we can tell they were working outside. So they show multiple signs of labor stress throughout their bones, especially in the hamstrings, especially in the biceps areas. And they seem to be a wealthy tomb. If there is a difference between that and the mausoleum, it may be that they got their ivory from hippos and not from elephants. And this is still more at the level of speculation. This is still something we're investigating. So this is what I mean that the hierarchy is a bit mixed up. It's not working in the ways that traditional norms sort of lend us to think that works. It's more of a community feel. And the big things that we see in death and burial practices is that early on in the Stela tradition, they're very much monuments for ancestor veneration rites or rites venerating or honoring the dead. And that seems to be the main purpose. And that seems to be what's being emphasized in the stela and in the burials, because we have evidence of people going back into these graves, taking the bones. The new thing that we have in Aksum that we don't have in sites before, such as Seglemen and so forth, is that we start finding cut marks on the bone. So they're taking the bodies out sooner, and we can tell they're ritualized cut marks because we don't see signs of disarticulation. We just see that they're having little systematic nicks down the bone to remove the last remnants of organic tissue to preserve the bones like relics. And the places that they have the most cut marks are the places of labor stress where the muscle tissue is starting to ossify. So that's why they had to clean those bones to get the last of that tissue off. And what's interesting is that we have some later burials in the Stela Park that are medieval from about 7th to 13th century. They also have the cut marks, but they don't have as much signs of labor stress. So this thing that started off as very technical in the production of an ancestor from the remains, in terms of cleaning their body for very technical reasons in these areas where the muscle tissue would ossify, later on, that's just a ritual tradition in the medieval times, right? So something very technical becomes something very ritual by the end of it, at least from what we can see in the window of the two cemetery tombs that we're looking at. So that's kind of what we see going on with the graves and the actual death and burial rites.
It's such extraordinary research, and I'm guessing all that you just mentioned are those key parts of a project that I know you've done a lot of work around for years, the Aksum Bones Project.
Yeah, so the Aksum Bones Project, that was part of my dissertation, and it was a bigger project than my dissertation, but what we were looking at is we were looking at 3 cemeteries, the Stela Park in Aksum, as well as the site of Seglemen, the place where we have basically the oldest Stela cemetery in the area that's excavated by the University of Napoli Orientale, Luis Nicola and Andrea Monzo. And then another medieval site called Missa's Body, which is actually one of the best bioarchaeological samples we have in all of Africa, that looks like it was a late Aksumite church that was later used as a late Aksumite to post Aksumite, like medieval times cemetery. And so we were trying to look at how these traditional rites change through time, especially with globalization, especially with the advent of Christianity in the area, and just understanding how death and people's experience of death is changing. And it's really more the point of that is more of a social message in that, when we see ancestor rites or these processing of bodies, these very like exotic looking things initially, people want to ascribe that as something that's like a relic of an archaic belief. But that's not what happens at Aksum, because the time when the ancestors have the greatest presence or the dead and the living are most closely connected is during the time of globalization, is during the time that the Stela Park becomes an area of the local, the only place where you don't see foreign objects. These stela all suddenly become monumental inside, suddenly become very ritualized, become more like community-ish based to some degree. And we start having this, they're at least taking bodies out sooner and they seem to be processing them more. So that we start seeing that, the ancestor, if that's what we call it, or this living dead, if that has a presence, it's something that's coming from like modernizing processes like globalization and urbanization and things like that, more than anything archaic. So that was the point that I was trying to look at, and looking at these 3 sites and seeing how death rites changed through time.
Summer is finally here, but for those of you just like me who are counting down the days until the leaves turn golden, the nights start drawing in, and it's finally acceptable to spend a whole weekend binge-watching true crime in your PJs, After Dark, myths, misdeeds, and the paranormal can transport you there right now, twice a week, every week.
Tudor murder, ancient ghosts, Victorian mysteries. Our podcast has you covered. I'm Maddie Pelling.
And I'm Anthony Delaney, and we are friends and historians who love to find out about the darker side of history.
Join us on the scaffold for Anne Boleyn's final moments. Step inside Tutankhamun's tomb, which is apparently cursed.
Watch a jury deliberate the fate of the last 3 women to be hanged for witchcraft in England.
Find us every Monday and Thursday wherever you get your podcasts, and now on YouTube. After Dark, Myths, Misdeeds, and the Paranormal is created by the award-winning network History Hit.
Still, we could cover so many more different themes, whether that be Aksumite mythology or their art and their pottery, their house styles, the military, and so on. I don't think we're going to have enough time to cover all of those, so maybe another chat in the future. However, we must talk about the coming of Christianity that you mentioned there, because it feels so important to the story. Before we actually talk about Christianity in Aksum, do we know much about the religion or religions that the Aksumites followed before Christianity arrived there?
We know a little bit. So we know that there is a South Arabian pantheon in the area. Al-Muqa is the most important of the deities that they talk about. And so what happens with the pre-Christian area between the various gods that are in the region is that they're kind of like mixing together, but kind of not. So Al-Muqa may be an aspect of Ishtar, or maybe an aspect of something they locally call a star, who at other times has some connection with Zeus, or at least the heavens.
And Ishtar, that's normally linked with Babylon as well. So that's going very far away.
Right. Yeah, it's linked to Babylon. And then at times it also has an aspect of like Venus in there as well.
Yes.
So we have this South Arabian pantheon, but Aksumites, it appears there's another version of polytheism in the area. And then there's also cosmopolitanism coming in from the Red Sea. So in Aksum itself, there's 3 gods that are mainly mentioned. There's a star. The primary god, however, is someone named Muharrem, who may be a version of Al-Muqa that was later adopted in a different way, but maybe its own thing. And then the Greece sort of cognate is more related to Ares. So that's the war god. So King Azana would claim that he was the son of Muharrem, the war god. And then there's another god named Beher that is also very important in the area. This goes a little bit further, but the Christian word for God is Exeber, and that made bear a relationship with Beher, which just means land. So Exeber, the Christian god, just means the Lord of the land. So there's this other polytheism that may or may not be related to the South Arabian one. And these are mostly come from inscriptions, but there's various gods that seem to be permutations of the sun and the moon and have different temporal aspects. So there's also Nuru and Habas. There's Dat Himyan and Dat Badan, which may be the dimming of the sun during different times of the year. So there's different permutations of like the sun and the moon, and they may be incorporating an aspect of temporality and what keeps them different, which may or may not bear a relationship with agricultural cycles. That's sort of like the go-to intuitive sort of understanding. But that's what we have in the area. Muharrem is the principal god mentioned in the inscriptions. The Aksumite king claimed to be a descendant or a son of Muharrem, at least until Christianity. So King Azana, cutting ahead a little bit, but King Azana is the one that we see converts to Christianity. So Christianity came from connections with the Red Sea trade, and there was probably already Christians in the area long before King Azana converts, especially in Adulis, where they have before, in addition to the 2 pantheons I was talking about, you have the more traditional Zeus, Poseidon, Ares mentioned in a throne inscription in Adulis. And then we have some churches, 4 churches in Adulis that are not well dated, but could be some of the earliest churches in Africa, and maybe somewhere in the 3rd to 6th century range. They're not really well dated, so this is more speculation than anything. But King Azana, we know himself converts to Christianity because we can actually see that on his coinage. So he has a crescent and a disc symbol on his earliest coins, and that gets replaced by a cross. And that matches up with some of the oral traditions in the area that talk about. So in the story, there's a shipwreck with two Syrians that are later captured and brought to the father, King Azana. And one of them is made a tutor for King Azana, Frumentius. And King Azana, from that influence, converts to Christianity. Frumentius becomes the first major patriarch in Ethiopia, and that's how Christianity starts to begin. So these archaeological correlates match up in that we do see King Azana converting earlier in the coinage, and not only that, but in the inscriptions. And so when King Azana makes inscriptions, he makes them in Giz, Greek, Sabian as well. And the Greek inscriptions, he is very much talking about the Holy Trinity when he references his victories. In the same text, in the Giz inscription, he's very, very ambiguous on who he's dedicating his victory to. So he's totally a Christian to foreigners, but he may not be a Christian to people around, at least in Aksum. But we do see there is oral tradition that at a later time in the 5th to 6th centuries, a migration of 9 saints from Syria come and help convert the population in Aksum. And that is the time that we start seeing crosses made on the pottery. And we do start having datings for more of the earlier churches in the area. So that's how we understand the coming of Christianity, and so far how it's matching up with the archaeological correlates.
I mean, it's stunning. And King Azana, so 4th century, so about the same time as Constantine the Great, starts embracing Christianity in the Roman Empire as well. So it is pretty early in the scheme of things. And you mentioned there Ge'ez as well. Is that the religious Christian language of Ethiopia or of Aksum?
Yeah, so it was probably the primary language of Aksum, so that we see a lot of inscriptions in Giz. And then we also see one of the cool things to talk about this interaction with Christianity is on the island of Socotra near Ethiopia, which was a waypoint for this trade, where we have Giz written alongside Aramaic, the language of Israel, written alongside Brahmi and all these other scripts and so forth. So that was the main language of Aksum as far as we can tell. And then today it remains as a language of the church. So even today, people will speak in Giz or write in Giz within the church tradition as well. So it's preserved within the religion.
It's so interesting that, you mentioned a do list there and possible early churches there. I remember talking to William Dalrymple and Steve Sybostom about discoveries of a Buddha in Berenike. So it's interesting
Yeah.
whether there could be evidence of Buddhism there as well at that time, kind of a religious melting pot because of that trade. And ultimately Christianity is the one that emerges on top.
Yeah, and going with what I was talking about earlier with the patchiness of Aksum, at least socially, and some of these cultural traditions, you probably had different patchiness of that cosmopolitanism throughout the Aksumite area. So some place like Adulis was very, very cosmopolitan and very heavily involved in the trade. But, Aksum seems to be more of a like regional African injection into the trade. And that's something we're still investigating. The full range of archaeological correlates for that trade, we don't have a full understanding of at Aksum. And thinking through how those mix together is one of the future research questions. But it certainly is a cosmopolitan area, just from how we see the different categories being made. King Azana is one of the first people to use the word Ethiopia for Ethiopia, which historically might have referred to Nubia or something, but he is very much like almost co-opting the name Ethiopia because of the respect that it had to refer to himself. He's almost playing like a propaganda game here on how he gets envisioned to all these foreign powers and the trade in this international sphere, along with the various categories being made. He's very much trying to curate what his kingdom and what his category is going to be seen as.
Still, very quickly before we end, because I've used a lot of your time for this wonderful interview and don't want to go on too long. But one more question on Christianity quickly is, of course, Ethiopia and the Kingdom of Aksum becomes strongly associated with the Ark of the Covenant and I guess the Queen of Sheba earlier as well. I mean, can you explain a little bit as to why and how these famous names from the Old Testament become so strongly associated with Aksum and Ethiopia more generally?
Yeah, so that is one of the longest lived traditions that we see in Ethiopia. And one of the big things that people are really interested in, what's known for. So The primary text for that is a later medieval text called the Kebra Nagast, which it's more associated with the rise of the Amhara Empire, which is a bit south of Aksum, and itself probably dates to the 13th century in textual form. However, it probably has oral tradition components that go back earlier, maybe during the time of Aksum, because there's this one point where they just randomly start talking up and praising an Aksumite king named Gaba Maskal for almost no reason at all in the text. So that's the thing that makes people think like, okay, that has to be something earlier that found its way in as part of this novel. So that's the primary text. There's all this investigation looking into how it's earlier. We already have these connections going on with the Middle East. Not only I mentioned with Aramaic, but also with some of the crop packages we see in the area. Wheat and barley from the Near East come in pretty early as well. In addition, one of the biggest texts that we're not really sure in the dating of that talks about the Queen of Sheba legend relating to Ethiopia is actually not from Ethiopia. It's from Egypt and is the Testament of Solomon, which is dated anywhere from like the 1st century CE to like medieval times. But so it's a fake text. It's someone pretending to be Solomon and talking. It's a big text in the occult because it talks about the various like demons and jinns that Solomon was commanding to build his temple. But there is a brief interlude where a queen from the south, the Queen of Sheba, comes to visit him. And that seems to be the first reference, if it does date indeed that early, of the Queen of Sheba myth. And it actually doesn't come from Ethiopia. So Wendy Belcher is currently doing research on this, on how the Queen of Sheba story, that's not just an Ethiopian tradition related to the medieval ages. It's more of like a pan-African narrative that's emerging between Ethiopia to Egypt. Now, the Ark of the Covenant, the story is that the Queen of Sheba visits King Solomon, and they have a son who is the first emperor of Ethiopia, King Menelik I. And that bloodline lasts in Ethiopia until Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974. So the story is Queen Menelik visits his father, and he brings back 3 things: the Ring of Solomon. He brings back an instrument like a lyre that we do have in Ethiopia today called the begana. And he brings back the Beta Israel tribe, which was also in Ethiopia. And in addition to that, either he brings back or some of his followers go and bring back themselves, but then is later justified somehow, the Ark of the Covenant. And then that is to have rested in Aksum. And you can go see the chapel today where it's kept in Mariam Sion Church. And you can also see it in the mornings. The Ethiopian calendar has 13 months. And the first 7 days of each month, they have something called the Mhalela, which they actually take the ark on a procession around the historic center of Aksum every morning. So you can go see that today. And that has been a long-lived part of the Ethiopian tradition. And there's not only the ark, but every church has something called a tablet. And a tablet is a copy of the ark. But, in the West, we kind of see like a copy as sort of an artificial knockoff, something that's completely sort of against the original. In Ethiopia, it's seen as having aspects of the original. So a church is not a church if it doesn't have a tablet. And so that tradition is long-lived in Ethiopia and centralizes the church and centralizes the Christian tradition. So those are the ways that it matches up with what we see with the presence of the other things that, such as the Begana that Menelik I was supposed to have had, and the interactions that we see playing out during this time between Aksum and the region of Israel and Middle East. And we do find Aksumite coinage in Palestine and Israel as well. And in Palestine particularly, there's Aksumite knockoffs. There's the Roman copies of Aksumite coins, but there's also Aksumite coins. And the key thing is that we see silver and bronze coins in Aksum. So Aksumite coinage, gold coins were used as international currency, but the silver and bronze forms were not. And so that's been taken to mean that we actually have visitors going between the two regions when we find those coins there.
Wow. Well, Dill, what a way to end it. Thank you for doing those explanations, because it feels an important part of the story and, of course, the heritage of Ethiopia. We've covered so much in the last hour or so, and I think we'll wrap it up there. As mentioned, we can cover so much more in another chat, whether it's the domestic houses, pottery, art, mythology. and of course the ultimate fall of the Kingdom of Aksum, although that feels us going a little too far into the medieval period for the ancients' liking. But Dil, this has been absolutely brilliant. And when are you next out in Aksum? What's the next big Aksum project for you?
I will probably be going again next year in the winter time. I just arrived a couple of months ago from there. Just to see with my colleagues and see what research they're up to. I'm going to do a short bioarchaeological project on a medieval cemetery. They're looking more into some of how these Christian rites change. Some of those rites of retrieval of bodies and stuff like that seem to continue in the Christian era in their own form. So I'm going to look more at that. And then we're going to start forming our project with some of the museum specialists and looking at the indigenous archaeologists in the area and this big inventory of, you go to monasteries, you see Ayakaba pottery, you see Buddhist coins, things like that. Getting a full idea of exploring that to look at some of these early material heritage traditions in Ethiopia.
Dil, it just goes to me to say thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tristan. And thank you so much for your interest. We always get very excited about people's interest in Aksum. It's a big part in the culture today to be able to celebrate heritage, to celebrate Aksumite heritage, and people see that inheritance of that down. So when we see people excited about it, it's very much so that they seem to be engaging in the culture, engaging in the same celebrations of heritage that people prize. So we feel very connected to that. It's a very exciting thing to see in people.
Well, there you go. There was the archaeologist Dil Singh Basanti giving you a wonderful introduction, an all-rounded introduction to the Kingdom of Aksum. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for listening. Please follow The Ancients on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us and you'll be doing us a big favour. If you leave us a rating as well, we'd really appreciate that. Leave us a comment. We'd love to hear what you thought about the episode. We love hearing from you. Don't forget, you can also listen to us and all of History Hits podcasts ad-free and watch hundreds of TV documentaries when you subscribe at historyhit.com/subscribe. Now that's enough from me, and I'll see you in the next episode.